We're delighted to welcome Rabbi Lynn Landsberg and Barbara Weinstein at the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, who will be speaking with us today about the ways congregations can become more engaged in advocacy work to advance and protect the rights of people with disabilities. It's my pleasure now to introduce you to Rabbi Lynn Landsberg, Senior Advisor on Disability Issues for the Religious Action Center of Reform Judaism, and Barbara Weinstein, Associate Director of the RAC and Director of the Commission on Social Action.
Hi, everybody. This is Lynn Landsberg. I want to tell you that in my former life, I was an effortless multitasker, a fast talker, and a quick thinker. I had speaking engagements across the country and composed my most powerful speeches in airplanes and taxis. For 8 years, I was the Associate Director of the Religious Action Center, which you may know is the D.C. Social Justice Advocacy Office of the Reform Movement. One of my favorite responsibilities was to represent the Reform Movement as a speaker at protest rallies on the D.C. Mall. I would speak on women's issues or gay rights or all kinds of economic justice issues, sometimes from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial to 500,000 or more people. And I did this with only jotted notes. All that came to a screeching halt one Sunday morning in January 1999. While driving my then 8-year-old son Jesse to religious school, our Jeep skidded on a patch of black ice and wrapped around a tree. That tree came through my window and left me unconscious and bleeding with a traumatic brain injury. Thank God Jesse was not hurt. After brain surgery, I spent 6 weeks in a coma. When I slowly awoke, I was unable to walk, talk, read, concentrate, or focus for any time at all. Years and years of intensive rehabilitation followed. Therapists had to reteach me everything. Over the years, I've slowly relearned how to live, but the traumatic brain injury has left me with persistent physical and cognitive challenges. Now I walk with a cane, require assistance with minor tasks, and my speech therapist says I must speak slowly to be best understood. For a native New Yorker, that is the hardest part. And these days, I must speak with a text written out word for word. Using only notes is history for me. When I re-entered the world, I was shocked at what I learned. Before my injury, I belonged to one minority that was cohesive, strong, articulate, and definitely heard, the American Jewish community. What I learned was that I now belong to a second minority that is daily the victim of discrimination. And though about 10 times larger than the American Jewish community, 15 years ago, when I became a member of this minority called the Americans with Disabilities, it was almost invisible and barely heard. My own experience with discrimination was relatively minor but still jarring. I used a wheelchair for a full year. When my husband and I would go out for dinner, waiters would invariably ask him what I wanted to order, incorrectly assuming that because I used a wheelchair, I could not read the menu or make decisions for myself. Even now, when I walk into high-end department stores with a cane, I might as well be invisible because no one comes near me. And believe me, I did not lose the ability to spend money. Every day, in general meetings, social situations, or events large and small, people look at the cane first. I sense their discomfort, and I ultimately feel dismissed. However, when I attend disability-related meetings or activities, people don't even see the cane. They just see Lynn Landsberg, and I am invited to participate as a whole person. This is the deepest desire of the disability community, to have people see past the disability and acknowledge the person first. In addition to the physical toll my accident rendered, over time I began to feel the growing emotional toll. You would think that this would make me lose my faith, but no, it in fact strengthened my spiritual core. What it ultimately did was to define my spiritual mission. That is to help people understand a fundamental principle of Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, that we are all of us created B'Tselem Elohim, in God's likeness. The other religions don't use that term, but they all say created in God's likeness. But as disability advocates across the nation know well, now, 15 years later, discrimination still permeates every aspect of life for this minority. In 1990, when I was Associate Director of the RAC, I worked on behalf of the Reform Movement along with other advocates from national faith groups on a huge new bill that I never in my wildest dreams thought would directly affect my life. In 1990, we helped Congress pass the Americans with Disabilities Act, called the ADA. The ADA successfully tackled only 2 of the 3 issues that had stopped Americans with disabilities from living full lives. 1, it abolished public physical barriers, making the outside world accessible. And 2, the ADA allowed children and adults to learn through mandatory accommodations in public schools and universities across the nation. However, the ADA was unsuccessful in accomplishing its 3rd goal, to abolish discrimination. Our Jewish community must fully understand what Senator Tom Harkin, an original sponsor of the bill, means when he says, quote, "With the ADA, we have climbed the mountain and reached the top, but we still have not fully arrived at the promised land," close quote. The ADA mandates access to public buildings, but it cannot mandate access to the human heart. We people with disabilities remain undesirables or at best outsiders in every basic sphere of life: education, recreation, social life, religious life, and especially employment. For the last 50 years, due to discrimination, more than 2/3 of Americans with disabilities of working age who can work and want to work are unemployed or underemployed, recession or no recession. It is a joke in the disability community that Americans with disabilities are the only Americans who want to pay taxes. We Jews must understand and admit that we too discriminate by not demanding that Jews with disabilities have equal access not only to our front doors, but to all things Jewish, including jobs. Synagogues rightly worry about access to the Bima, but what about jobs on the Bima, or jobs in synagogue offices, or jobs in Jewish organizations, agencies, schools, or camps? The list is endless. It is especially imperative that we help alleviate such poverty by looking beyond religious job openings. We must educate all members of our community and urge all businesses, employers, and CEOs to seek qualified Americans with disabilities as job applicants to fill open positions. In many places in our texts, we are told we must rest on Shabbat. From my life before the brain injury, I know well how liberating it is to rest on Shabbat. But now I understand that Shabbat rest implies that you have spent 6 days creating, producing, and providing. We must all comprehend that rest is different from doing nothing. Nothing is what the majority of people with disabilities do all week with their talents and credentials because they are denied employment. And employment discrimination makes people poor. As concerned as we are about economic justice, the American Jewish community has failed to understand on a gut level a glaring reality. Adults with disabilities in the U.S. experience poverty rates at twice the national average. Shabbat rest is a holy privilege. One cannot rest if one does not have meaningful work to precede it. Spend your Shabbats being joyful if you can truly rest, and spend your weekdays working to help lift Americans with disabilities out of poverty and out of Jewish anonymity. When those with and without disabilities are given the opportunity all week to create, to produce, and to provide, then we all can truly rest. And if we want to make changes in our country in order to include people with disabilities in every walk of life, we must begin by opening the eyes of Americans without disabilities and help them understand that they have to change their attitudes. There is a saying in the disability community that goes, before ramping buildings, you've got to ramp attitudes. Before ramping buildings, you've got to ramp attitudes. We've got to work hard to help our fellow Americans change their attitudes from pity to possibilities. In fact, it says exactly that in our text. In Midrash Tehillim, the text comments on Psalm 82, verse 3, which reads, "Defend the poor and the orphan, do justice to the afflicted and the needy." The Midrash actually says, and I quote, "It does not say have pity on them, but do justice to them." Close quote. After the ADA passed in 1990, religious groups thought that it was a done deal. But through my experience as a new member of this minority, I knew differently. So we at the RAP helped form the Jewish Disability Network, called the JDN, Jewish Disability Network, a disability rights coalition made up of the Washington representatives of all the national Jewish organizations and movements. The RAC co-chairs the JDN with the D.C. Office of Federation. The JDN coalition has activated Jews across the country to articulate to their elected officials why the civil rights of people with disabilities, like equal employment, is in fact a religious issue. We have helped representatives and senators understand that we Jewish Americans believe that people with disabilities are, like all Americans, created B'Tselem Elohim in God's image. The larger organized national disability advocacy community credits the religious voices of our Jewish coalition with the proven ability to gain the yay votes of conservatives who are loath to inflict government regulations on private enterprise, states, schools, and the public in general. In fact, the disability advocacy folks credit us for helping to pass the ADA Amendments Act, which is a legislative remedy to many anti-ADA court decisions. Using our religious voices, the JDN has been so successful that the very influential AAPD, the American Association of People with Disabilities, asked us to help them form an interfaith disability advocacy coalition. What is now known as IDAC, Interfaith Disability Advocacy Coalition, has as members 33 national Catholic, Protestant, Jewish, Muslim, Hindu, and Sikh organizations. Our Jewish coalition has, for the last 4 years, held a congressional briefing on Capitol Hill. Every February, which is Jewish Disability Awareness Month, our Jewish Disability Coalition sponsors Jewish Disability Advocacy Day, JDAD, Jewish Disability Advocacy Day, drawing Jewish advocates from across the country. The day begins with, of course, food, followed by disability policy experts who teach us about the most important timely legislative issues. Then we learn how to lobby specifically on these issues. After a sumptuous lunch, the participants go off to attend pre-arranged meetings to lobby their congressional representatives. It has been 15 years since my accident. I'm glad to tell you today I'm witnessing a slow but positive change in our community. I see a number of synagogues with buildings and programs that have been altered to accommodate. However, to my dismay, many synagogues I visit tell me that their attempts to welcome people with disabilities fall under the purview of their social action committee. We must help our synagogues understand that welcoming people with disabilities is not a social action item. Defining accommodations that allow people in the synagogue to pray as social action is akin to defining Hebrew lessons that allow kids to become B'nai Mitzvah as social action. Social action is fighting discrimination in the Jewish community and the larger world. Social action is teaching every segment of our community about this American minority that is seldom acknowledged. Social action is advocating for public policy that protects the rights of people with disabilities. So try to understand my mixed feelings as I travel around the country. I'm happy to find some synagogues and communities beginning to become aware of and include people with disabilities. However, I'm concerned that we Jews can all ultimately model positive behavior, but that does not make it law. I see the role of the Jewish community as going beyond inclusion to real political advocacy. To help you understand how you and the members of your congregation to affect change on the national and local level, I turn this webinar over to Barbara Weinstein. Barbara Weinstein is now the Religious Action Center's Associate Director. She directs legislative policies and oversees the 6 Religious Action Center legislative assistants and their 40-plus issues. Barbara knows well the lesson she is about to teach us, how to best advocate your position to your elected official. Because before joining the RAC, Barbara spent 5 years working in the U.S. House of Representatives. Even though she was raised in Montreal, Barbara is a longtime resident of Washington, D.C., and she holds an M.A. in political management from the George Washington University. I now introduce Barbara Weinstein.
Thank you, Lynn. Thank you again for joining us, and thank you to Edie for inviting me to be part of this. And it's always great to have any opportunity to work with Lynn, as I'm sure many of you already know. A lot of us are very comfortable with the action side of social justice work. But social justice really is a two-sided coin. One side is advocacy, and the other side is action. And the action side kind of appeals to our kind of best human instincts, right? We see the difference that we can make in people's lives if we install a ramp in our congregation, or we adapt our curriculum, or we buy copies of the Mishkan Tefillah that are accessible for those with visual impairments, right? We're all terrific at acts of tzedakah or gemilut chasadim, loving kindness, and they really reflect a core part of our Jewish ethos. But we also need to think on a more broad level about how we can transform people's lives. We always like to share the story of the parable of a town that had a beautiful river flowing through it, and one day someone walking by the river saw a person being swept downstream and about to go over the waterfall that was at the end of the river. And so they threw in a piece of rope and they dragged out the person and saved their lives. And not long after that, the town had a meeting, and the person who had been the lifesaver said, you know, if we have people that are coming downriver, we should station a guard there to prevent people from being rushed over the waterfall. And so the town got together and they hired a guard to stand at the river, and pretty soon the guard was pulling out person after person from the river. And they said, you know, there's too many people for one guard. What if we put up a net? And so they said, absolutely, and they put up a net at the end of the river. And eventually their people were just piling up, being caught by the net. And finally the town got together again, and someone stood up and said, wait a minute, we need to go upstream and figure out how we can stop people from falling into the river in the first place. And that's really a great example of how we need to combine the direct action, the direct service, one-to-one that transforms lives, with a more holistic approach that lets us address the needs of people at a much broader level. And that's why action and advocacy are so important. Lynn spoke a moment ago about the Americans with Disabilities Act of 1990 and what a transformative impact that has had on people with disabilities in this country. And it's true, but the reality is that the ADA didn't become law overnight, and it didn't become law without controversy. It really took advocacy to take this great idea and get it passed into law, get it passed by Congress, signed into law by the President, and for us to see the many benefits that it has brought since 1990 to people nationwide. It's the strength of the advocacy behind that bill that led to more accessible buildings and sidewalks and anti-discrimination provisions. But there was opposition from the business community and even the faith community. Certain segments were concerned about the costs of upgrading and adapting their buildings, and they shared those views with members of Congress. Thankfully, the views of people who understood what an important and positive impact the ADA would make won the day. But it's just a great example of what a difference advocacy makes between changing the world around us to reflect our highest aspirations and values and kind of muddling through with a less than perfect situation. Up on the screen, you see a few examples of some great Jewish lobbyists. You know, the first great Jewish lobbyist I always like to think of is Abraham, right? Abraham lobbied God on behalf of the people of Sodom and Gomorrah. When God said he was going to destroy the towns, Abraham didn't say, okay, have at it. Abraham said, no, what if I can find 50 or 40 or 30 or 20 or 10 righteous people? And eventually, obviously, God did destroy the towns, but not without Abraham speaking up. And other examples like Queen Esther, who we just celebrated during the holiday of Purim, who lobbied King Ahasuerus on behalf of the Jews of Persia. Or Moses, of course, who is a great example of someone who speaks on behalf of a community that he is a part of and people in a community that he has no direct connection to, right? We have this great story of Moses once he flees Egypt, encountering the women at the well in Midian who are being harassed, and Moses speaks out and he intervenes. He tries to stop that situation. He doesn't have any connection to these women, but he saw this injustice. Just as each of us, whether we are someone with a disability or not, see an injustice that we want to remedy. That's why advocacy is so important. And Moses is another great example because he knows the importance of both action and advocacy, right? He lobbies Pharaoh, and when lobbying doesn't work, Moses takes action and he leads history's first great march for social justice, which we know as Exodus. And Moses, of course, is also a person with a disability, right? We know that Moses had some sort of speech impediment. A great example for what we're doing here today. But he didn't let that disability stop him from being an advocate. But he knew enough to know that he needed help, that he couldn't do this work alone. And so he took Aaron with him. And Aaron stood there and was a source of strength and support to Moses. And it's a great lesson for how advocacy should be done. We should never do this work alone. We should always speak ourselves and be sources of strength and support for others doing this work together, right? And it really speaks to Hillel's dictum, if I am not for myself, who will be for me? If I am only for myself, what am I? And if not now, when? That really is the core lesson of why advocacy is so important. Advocacy is also important because it allows us to strengthen our congregants beyond the congregation's walls. Accessibility within the synagogue is vital, but if we're going to really be a caring community, we have to care about all aspects of our congregants' lives. So are they able to work? Or are they struggling with the needs of a family member? Can they support themselves financially? Is the world open or closed to them? You know, for our Judaism to have meaning, it's got to look at the whole person, their whole experience, and not just what happens to them within our walls. And we can't abdicate the responsibility to speak to others. You know, we are very proud of the work we do here at the Religious Action Center in Washington, but the only reason that members of Congress have any interest in what we have to say is because they know that we represent an active, engaged, and informed constituency. And so they, as decision makers, need to hear from their constituents, right? They are responsible to you, whether you voted for them or didn't vote for them. They are your representatives, and so they need to hear what your interests and priorities and concerns are. Now, I know that there's often concern that advocacy might be some sort of violation of the tax-exempt status of the congregation, and I want to address some of those concerns right off the bat. So advocacy will not risk your tax-exempt status as long as it's done to a limited degree, and that's sort of been loosely interpreted to be 2 to 3% of the congregation's budget. And advocacy can include supporting or opposing legislation or ballot initiatives or other government actions. So it can be no more than an insubstantial part of your activity, but it is absolutely permissible. What is not permissible is engaging in activities on behalf of or in opposition to any candidate or party for any office. And that includes candidates who are running who are members of the synagogue. So if you have someone running for mayor or Congress or, heck, the White House who's a member of your congregation, that's fantastic. But the congregation cannot do anything for that individual that it wouldn't do for all candidates on an equal basis. And I'd be happy to share more with you offline about that if anyone has any questions. So how do we begin our work as advocates? You know, today we're talking about disability rights. That sort of gets us over the first hurdle, which is how do you choose an issue? And how do you kind of set that in motion? And the most important thing is in not just choosing an issue, but throughout the whole process of advocacy is allowing all voices to be heard. You know, on the screen you see a picture of a page of Talmud. The page of Talmud is a great way to visualize how you should set this process in motion. So you have the question before us that the page of Talmud is addressing. In the center, you have the consensus opinion of our sages, and around it, you have all the different minority opinions on the issue, right? So the same goes for our synagogues. We're debating an issue, we're discussing an issue. We should not be afraid to reach consensus on an issue, but we shouldn't silence the minority voices either. We need to give an opportunity for all voices to be heard so that everyone continues to feel like they have a role and a contribution to make to our congregation. You might not get unanimity, but we can strive for consensus. It's always great to draw up sort of a statement of principles about what your goals are so that everyone's working off the same playbook. The second thing you want to do is involve all areas of congregational life, right? From the rabbi who can educate the congregation through a sermon and be a powerful public voice in the community and beyond, right? A lot of members of Congress will, see our rabbis as direct representatives of God on earth. And that's a pretty powerful role to play. So we should take advantage of that and include the rabbi in all the advocacy work that we do. Think about the role that we can play as temple administrators, speaking and taking care of not just what the synagogue's day-to-day functions and the decisions that affect just the internal life of the synagogue, but the synagogue as a place, a house of worship among many houses of worship in the community, right? Not just other synagogues from other Jewish denominations, but other churches and mosques and meeting houses. Temple administrators banding together across denominational lines to advocate for something that is crucial to them is going to get a lot more attention than any one temple administrator or, quite frankly, any group of Jewish temple administrators acting alone. Think about the president of the congregation and how they can share on their networks with other temple presidents the advocacy priorities of the congregation or the interests of the congregation and generate support from temple presidents in other cities in a particular state or other cities nationwide to expand upon the support among lawmakers for whatever the issue we're advocating for is. Think about how we can include the students in our religious school. One of the most successful programs we run here at the RAC is our Litaken Teen Social Justice Seminars, which we run 6 times a year for high school students, usually confirmation age students, 15 or 16 years old. And they come to Washington for a weekend and they learn about different social justice issues, among them the rights of people with disabilities. And then they spend Monday on Capitol Hill meeting with their senators and congressmen and talking to them about the issues that they care about. We've seen the actual impact that these lobby visits have from students who, quite frankly, are not even old enough to vote. Congressman Ted Deutsch from Florida joined as a co-sponsor on a bill that he knew nothing about until our Litaken students lobbied him on it. Congressman Danny Davis from Illinois, within just a Chicago congressman, actually was about to go to the floor of the House of Representatives and speak about gun violence prevention when he met with a group of our Litaken high school students and was so impressed by what they had to say that he scrapped his own remarks and he delivered theirs on the floor of the House of Representatives. No elected official ever asks how old the author is when they read a letter from a constituent. So involving our students, who can be some of the most effective advocates we have in our advocacy work, is key. And there are, of course, lots of other categories we can think of including in our synagogues, from the Men of Reform Judaism to WRJ groups and beyond. But the way to think about this is, what is your unique voice that you bring to the table? There's a great quote, I think it's from Oscar Wilde, who said, "Be yourself. Everyone else is already taken." And it's a great way to think of what our advocacy should look like. What makes our voice unique in this advocacy effort? If you hit on that, then you're able to build on it and think creatively about how it can really amplify your advocacy efforts. So, for example, if you're the WRJ group in the synagogue, think about how more than 50% of American women are older than 65 and living with a disability, right? Or think about how in developing countries, if you think it's a challenge being a person with a disability, try being a woman and a person with a disability. They are even more vulnerable and marginalized. So that's a unique voice that a group of women within our synagogues can bring to their advocacy effort. Another tip is to look for partners. And I referenced this earlier, for example, about how a temple administrator can work with other administrators from synagogues or other houses of worship. But you have to think about advocacy always as a team sport. So looking for other partners within the Reformed Jewish community or other streams of North American Jewry or other faith denominations, and of course in the secular community as well. So whether that includes academics or public policy professionals or social service providers or the countless other groups that can stand with us and do our advocacy, all of that makes us stronger advocates for whatever the issue is we're talking about. We also want to think about the range of ways in which we can do advocacy. There is, of course, the lobby visit where you sit in the elected official's office and you talk with them about the issue you care about, and that's great. But we recognize it's time-consuming and you've got to figure out everyone's schedule, so there are other things you can do as well. You can send letters, either individually, you can create a template and encourage members of the congregation to send a letter based on that template to their member of Congress individually, or you could collect them all and send them in one big packet. You could do a sign-on petition when people come to services each week, have them add their name to a petition that then goes off to your elected official whose thoughts you're trying to influence. And there's other means as well, like writing op-eds. It's a great way, for example, for the rabbi to get his or her views known in the broader community. And that can be an op-ed in the local Jewish paper or in the secular press as well. There's two bills I want to talk about briefly that really need your advocacy right now. And I spoke a little bit at the beginning about the importance of ensuring that our congregants are well beyond the doors of the congregation. And these two bills really speak to that issue in particular. The first one is known as the Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disabilities. And about 650 million people, or about 10% of the world's population, live with a disability. And we know that in developing countries, 90% of kids who have a disability don't actually go to school. So the CRPD, as it's known, is this international effort at the United Nations to achieve equality of opportunity and full participation and independent living and economic self-sufficiency for people with disabilities. And it's really based off that 1990 Americans with Disabilities Act, which itself was about empowering people with disabilities in their own lives. So the CRPD is not just great for people living with disabilities around the world, but it's actually great for Americans too, because it would make those traveling abroad with disabilities have an easier time of it. And we think about in the last 10, 12 years, with more and more veterans returning from overseas with disabilities, we don't want to have them come home and not be able to travel the world as they want to. We want them to be able to do everything they want to and should be able to do. So the CRPD would bring us closer to achieving that goal. And if you think back to your high school civics class, you remember that an international treaty is signed by the president, but it needs to be ratified by the Senate. Well, in 2012, in a pretty shameful vote, the Senate failed to ratify the CRPD by just 5 votes. And so our goal is to make sure that this bill is voted on again and that it is this time passed. And I can tell you that a few of the reasons that the bill failed on its first vote was that there were some senators who philosophically opposed the United Nations and the work that it does. There are some who were swayed by really erroneous arguments about this kind of treaty interfering with, for example, parents who want to homeschool their children in this country. And there were some also erroneous and really misleading arguments made about the impact the treaty's call for free or affordable health care would have on reproductive health. And some claim that it would, for example, lead to state sterilization of people with disabilities. These are all red herrings, and it's really shameful that this bill failed in the Senate. There's no question that U.S. law remains paramount, that nothing takes away the rights of parents to make decisions for their own children, and we really need the Senate to vote again and pass the CRPD. And if you go onto the RAC's website at rac.org/disabilities, you can see the action alerts that we have up on this bill and all the information about it, and you can send an email off to your senators telling them how important it is that they vote on and support the CRPD. The second bill I want to encourage you to be advocates on is called the ABLE Act, the Achieving a Better Life Experience. And unfortunately, the current reality is that the law discourages independence and savings by and for people with disabilities, right? To qualify for many services, I'm sure as many people in this network know, you can only save $2,000 and earn $700 a month. So it's actually a disincentive to earning and saving among people with disabilities. And it stands in real contrast, for example, to parents who save for their kids' college education, through tax-free savings accounts. The same doesn't hold true for parents who want to help save for the needs of their child with a disability, whether those are medical or dental care or education or community-based supports or employment training or assistive technology or housing and transportation and on and on and on. So what the ABLE Act does is create these tax-free savings plans modeled after college saving plans that would allow people with disabilities and their families to save for the future. And those funds would supplement existing income, like those from Medicaid or SSI or private insurance. And the money saved would not count against an individual's eligibility for any federal benefits program. It's a bipartisan bill. It's got tremendous support of 68 senators in the House, 68 senators in the Senate, and 345 House members. And in a particularly impressive move, the Senate Majority Leader Harry Reid and the Senate Minority Leader Mitch McConnell both have signed on as co-sponsors. So there is tremendous support for this bill, and now we just need Congress to focus on it and get it passed, and you, being advocates for that, can really make a difference. Letting your representative and senators know that you support the ABLE Act and want to see a vote on it this year is crucial. So those are just two of the key bills that could really use your voice advocating for them to kind of achieve the same success that we saw with the ADA in 1990 and the transformational effect it's had on people's lives across the country. There are other ways you can lift your voice as well. If you haven't come on Lit-Tech-N or your congregation hasn't come on Lit-Tech-N, I encourage you to take a look at that. You can read more about the Lit-Tech-N program at rac.org/Lit-Tech-N. It's a fantastic way of including our students in this work where their voices, for all the reasons I shared earlier, are really so impactful. It is truly a transformational program and shows that there is no age limit to being a really effective advocate. Next February, I hope we'll see you in D.C. for Jewish Disability Advocacy Day, where we'll join with others in the Jewish community to make sure our members of Congress know what our priorities are as advocates for and with people with disabilities. And finally, I hope we'll see you at the RAC's Consultation on Conscience in April 2015, which is our flagship public policy conference, and we join together for 3 days of exploring the social justice issues that are going to be on the congressional agenda once the new Congress begins that January. So with that, I'm going to share with you this final slide, which shares a couple more of the resources that we have for you at the RAC. And of course, the most powerful resources we have are the members of our staff, and I hope that you'll continue to think of all of us in that building on the bottom left there, the Religious Action Center, as resources for you as you do this work of being the most effective advocates that we can be for this issue that we care about so deeply. One of the most important things is having someone who can share their personal experience of a challenge that they've faced or a need that they're experiencing. You know, when we have personal relationships with people, then we see them facing a difficulty that obviously is the greatest incentive that we can have to get involved. And there really is, as I mentioned earlier, no limit to the groups within our congregation that we should be including in this work, from all ages to all the different ways that we kind of, I don't want to say divide or segment, but maybe group ourselves within the congregation, men, women, and our different interests. So having someone who has a participation in those groups or can approach the leaders of those groups in the congregation and share with them why this issue is important to them and why their help will transform their, their lives or meet a need that they're feeling, I think is really the key thing that moves us from a sense of compassion to a sense of action. This webinar hopefully is not the start of, or the start and end of our advocacy efforts, and if anything that I or Lynn said sparked questions that you or comments or concerns or ideas that you want to share more offline, I really hope that everyone on the call will feel, feel that we're here for you as resources and really want to be like Moses and Aaron, your partner in this work going forward.